think another, and obviously you pull from, like you said, many sources, but thinking about his chapter, the chapter that you have, the prodigal God, right,
Hmm.
where he talks about this idea of human rebellion isn't monolithic, that there's actually three ways to live instead of two, as you kind of put it in the book, right? Of one way to be reconciled to God and kind of two different ways to reject him. And he really plays on kind of the,
Hmm.
prodigal son, but also the older brother
Hmm.
to show those things, right? So maybe help us unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. This is a really key aspect of Keller's teaching that I think developed over the years because he came to realize that though there is only one way to be saved, there are actually biblically two ways to be lost. And we naturally think of the more obvious sense of lostness, which is the younger brother in that parable in Luke 15. But what's so interesting is that Jesus speaks that parable not to pagans, but to Pharisees. The punchline of the parable is not what happens with the younger brother. The punchline is, and the ultimate focus of it is when the father goes out into the field to entreat his older son to come into the feast to be reconciled with his brother, and he's too proud. And that idea that we can be lost not just by failing to keep all the moral rules, but we can actually be lost by, in a sense, keeping the moral rules. The older brother says, have I not served you all these years and you
Hmm.
haven't so much as given me a lamb? And in other words, it's this sense that I've done you favors, God, and therefore you owe me salvation. And that's a more subtle and therefore insidious form of lostness. Another example is if you compare Romans 1 and Romans 2. So before you get to the gospel in Romans 3, you have two ways to be lost. Romans 3, one way to be saved. Romans 1 and 2, two ways to be lost. And we often focus on the kind of Romans 1 way of being lost, unapologetic idolatry. I live for myself and I'm proud of it. But the second way, Romans 2, is more subtle. I live for myself and no one can find out. And so Keller would say that in church, you could have two people sitting next to one another in the same pew, members of the same church, singing the same songs, involved in the same activities, hearing the same sermons, and yet they can be there, even though outwardly they look exactly the same. Inwardly, they can be there for completely different reasons. One can be
Yeah.
there to bring pleasure to the God who has saved them, and the other can be there to stay in God's good graces, to earn favor from God. And it's the difference between heaven and hell. And Keller had such a artful and I think incisive way of cutting to the heart of religious hypocrisy as a way of being lost.
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating. And I believe it's in this chapter too, where you have this quote, I believe it's from John Piper, where he's talking about something that Keller had said, and him and Piper thinking, like, that's kind of strange, but then to have Tim kind of explain, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah. Piper said that this insight from Keller revolutionized Piper's own preaching, his own understanding of preaching, because it is counterintuitive. What he heard Tim say was, that people in a place like New York City need to be warned against legalism. You need to preach against legalism. And Piper thought, hold on. I understand if you're ministering in the Deep South with a lot
Yeah.
of nominal Christianity talking against legalism, but don't you need to focus on, railing against the opposite, which is license in a plat. In other words, your churches in New York City are filled with younger brothers in Luke 15, not older brothers. So why are you preaching against older brothers? But here's what Keller said. He said that unless you warn against that other kind of lostness, that religious lostness, younger brother types will just assume that in order to get their life together or in order to become Christians, that they just need to go from Romans 1 to Romans 2. They're
Hmm.
just going to go from being the younger brother to an older brother. There's a beautiful word picture that the Puritan David Dixon said actually on his deathbed in 1662. He said, I have made a heap, a pile of all my bad works and a pile of all my good works, and I fled them both to Christ.
Hmm.
The default mode, though, of every human heart is moralism. It's this idea that I'm going to flee from the pile of my bad works to the pile of my good works, rather than running to Jesus and collapsing into his open arms through faith.